Welcome to Engaging ESG, where we consider, challenge, and celebrate the evolving world of environmental, social, and governance communications, all in an increasingly complex landscape. I'm Jennifer Owens, marketing executive and consultant.
And I'm Kati Callens, Global Head of Sustainability at Adobe. For Season 4, we're once again talking with climate leaders who are shaping the present and future of sustainability messaging. From connecting with stakeholders to crafting compelling impact stories, we're uncovering the strategies that worked and learning from those that didn't.
Whether you're a seasoned pro or new to the field, you'll find practical tips and insights in every episode.
And whether you're working on your first sustainability report or reimagining your organization's climate narrative, these conversations will help you navigate the complexities of ESG communications. Let's get started. Hi, Jen.
Hello. How are you doing?
I'm doing really good today. How are you?
I am very good. And I'm particularly excited because as our season is racing to its end here, we're getting to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is women and finance. And we're getting to add in the climate overlay. And so there's this super unfun stat that women receive less than 1% of climate finance in the US. So, boo. So I'm very psyched to be able to talk about why that is and how to make a difference. So,
yeah, I'm definitely pretty interested to hear what happens when the gender lens investing meets climate finance, why fixing this gap isn't just fair, it's really essential to the transition. I've read some of your pieces today, and so it feels like perfect timing to dive into a conversation with an expert on this topic.
Very much agree. And so who better to help us understand the intersection than our guest today, Jessica Espinoza, CEO of 2X Global, the organization that has mobilized $34 billion in gender lens investments since 2018. Jessica's work sits right at the convergence of gender equity and climate action, from creating the Gender Smart Climate Finance Toolkit to launching bold facilities that back women fund managers. She's also a board member, a mentor for Endeavor. She's an Obama Foundation Fellow and a PhD candidate because she has abundant free time researching the transformative potential of gender lens investing. Jessica, thank you. Thank you for taking your abundant free time and joining us on the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to join you today.
Wonderful. So let's start with the reality check, Jessica, just get everyone listening kind of on the same page about the state of play right now. So as you've noted in your research, women attract less than 1% of climate investment in the US and about 5% globally. What is the current mindset in how investors think about, or frankly don't think about, the intersection of gender and climate? And also, what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
Yeah, so most investors still treat gender really as a social add-on and climate as a technical or environmental problem. But the reality is climate is a capital allocation problem, and gender tells you where capital actually lands. And so in the US, especially, climate finance has become very tech-centric. So think hardware, scale, IP. It's very male-dominated in terms of the networks, and also very much growth at all cost, which disadvantages women founders and fund managers structurally. There's also this kind of lingering myth that if it's climate, it's automatically good for people. And that's just not true. Climate capital follows power, and power is still very unevenly distributed. So I think it's so fascinating to really look at the issue, right? What you just mentioned, the stats. So that's what got me interested. How is it possible that such a tiny, tiny proportion of capital flows to women overall? And then when we look at climate finance, it's even less than in general finance. And so kind of turning that big gap into an opportunity and really looking at what we're leaving on the table and why it makes not only impact sense, but also really business sense to change that is what got me interested in the topic. So we just talked about the situation in the US, right, which is particularly bleak, but If we look outside the US, in parts of Europe, for example, but especially also in emerging markets, we see that climate finance is defined differently. It's much more about agriculture, water, food systems, land use, resilience, and livelihoods. And so women are often the primary economic agents in these sectors. And that means that capital naturally reaches them more often. There's also in those geographies greater comfort with blended finance, with community-based models, and also impact accountability. And that's why you see the number creep up kind of closely to 5%, which is of course still very, very low, but that explains why it's a little bit higher in other geographies. So I think what's really important to understand is that the gender gap isn't just about who gets funded. It's about which climate solutions we've decided to count as real investments.
Oh, that's fascinating. And so you're saying the 5%, is that more of like a regenerative agriculture is higher than as a topic that the money for women is available?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not necessarily that the other geographies tackle the issue in substantially different ways. It's just the way climate finance is defined or what is being looked at in the US is just very, very tech-centric and very growth focused. So, highly scalable business models. Whereas in other geographies like Europe and especially emerging markets, it's more about, as you say, sustainable agriculture, food systems, also kind of more about livelihoods and resilience overall. So beyond tech, other solutions where women are the primary economic actors. And that's also why we see, if you define climate finance more broadly or differently in some geographies, then that by implication can mean that women reach or receive a bit more capital. I mean, it's still 5% is still ridiculous, right? But
and yet it's like when you do it's 4 million times bigger. It's just 5% instead of 1%. So yeah, the math. I think one of the topics that I'm always fascinated by, because having come through a season of working in climate finance, climate tech, Series A companies, who gets the money, who's running the company. One of the things that I'm most interested in and have written about is the multiplier effect of funding projects led by women, that the stats will tell you that women tend to put more of the profits back into their communities. They tend to be, as we go into, stats are always stereotypical, but a little more risk adverse. And so, but they're also known to be more successful when you look at the money that's given them and what comes back in returns. And so these have always been my arguments. And so I just wanted to kind of check my arguments against the smarty pants here. Are these true arguments for investing in women overall?
Yes. So
okay, good.
There's incredible evidence really demonstrating the business case. And there are, for example, studies by Boston Consulting Group and Mass Challenge that show that even though women receive such a tiny fraction of capital, those who do get funded make more than twice as much revenue per dollar invested compared to male peers. So, there is really a very strong business case. And in climate in particular, we also see a correlation. If climate finance is gender responsive, then you also see stronger climate outcomes. So even if you only care about climate, it's really smart to focus on women as well.
That's great. Yeah. And I think getting into how do we get more women in getting more climate finance, I know that there are actually tools that you have created with your organization. So I thought we could switch into that for our next question here. So the Gender Smart Climate Finance Toolkit is something that you have created, and folks can definitely look that up. We'll put links in the show notes so that folks can understand a little bit more about this tool. But what I think would be interesting to talk about next is what surprised you from that work? And for folks listening who are climate investors, what do you think that you wish they understood about gender in their portfolio strategy?
Yeah, so a few things that our 2X climate work shows. First of all, women disproportionately found or lead companies that are in adaptation, resilience, in food and agriculture, and nature-based solutions. When you look at traditional capital, and especially venture capital, overwhelmingly it funds mitigation, energy, mobility, and large-scale infrastructure. And so
interesting.
why? Right? Because mitigation investments look more bankable, they scale more predictably, and they often carry lower perceived risk. In contrast, adaptation tends to be more fragmented, more context specific, and is often undervalued, despite really being essential. And so this isn't about saying that mitigation is wrong. It's about recognizing that a climate strategy that's obsessed only with emission reductions is incomplete. And so we've kind of optimized climate finance for net zero and not for resilience. I think one thing that continues to surprise me is that there seems to be this big misunderstanding where investors think that gender equals women-led companies only. And in reality, gender shows up in governance, in workforce quality, supply chains, even in product design and customer outcomes, and in risk exposure. And so I think we really need that reframe that gender isn't a theme, it's a lens on value creation and risk. You don't need to be a gender fund to invest gender smart. You need better questions, better data, and better accountability.
Oh, I just love it so much because you see when companies are putting together their carbon credit portfolios and they're thinking geography, maybe they have a headquarters there or facilities there, or they're thinking geopolitical pressures, they're thinking project types. And I look and you think, well, why aren't you asking? This is a valuable piece of information across the entire chain of value in that particular project. And so as communicators, as the tech companies, as the finance companies, like how do you get people to switch from a nice to have to this is valuable information? You're missing the point if you're not asking this question. Like what can we do to help pitch this?
Yeah. So I think the trap to avoid is coming across as moralizing. I think that's when people often switch off, and also over-indexing on fairness language alone. So what we've seen work in practice is to anchor the story in outcomes, asking questions like who benefits, who bears the cost, who decides. So you make it about systems more than about identity. And the truth is, there is no just transition if the same groups keep capturing the upside, right? And so a helpful framing is to think about gender-blind climate finance that is often deepens inequality, it weakens adoption, it increases long-term risk. And gender-smart climate finance improves uptake, strengthens resilience, and protects returns over time. And now if we're communicating or pitching the just transition specifically, the gender gap persists because we've designed incentives almost exclusively around carbon metrics and not people outcomes. So a just transition really means that gender isn't a side objective. It's part of the mitigation path itself. And so if we want climate solutions that scale, that stick, that actually protect societies, then adaptation and climate inclusive models must be investable, right? Not optional. And so you can't build climate resilience without the people who are already doing the work. I think that is how I would pitch it and what usually resonates with audiences in our experience.
Right. And I know you work with hundreds of investors through your communities of practice. So you have a lot of experience communicating this with folks in the field who are giving out this money. What have you seen as the most common barriers that you encounter when you're helping organizations integrate gender lens into their climate investments?
Many investors are saying we don't have the data, we don't want to slow down deployment, or we're worried about getting it wrong. And so a good response to that is to really start where investors already are. Use entry points, not perfection. For instance, think about workforce data that you already have, or governance questions, or customer segmentation. And I also think it's really important that we normalize learning and this idea of going on a journey. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be intentional. And that's usually when, you take the first step and then you see results and you keep going. So what actually unlocks progress most effectively, based on what we've seen at 2X Global, is this idea of peer learning. So we have very active communities of practice where investors and financial institutions learn from peers, and that's very effective. Also seeing others like them that do it first or that already do it and, learning from their lessons. And then also just clear and very practical tools that are not overly complex, but are simple enough so you can put them in practice and get initial results that convince you of the case for it. What often surprises investors is the data consistently shows that gender smart climate strategies are not slower, they're actually more efficient. And to name perhaps one more powerful stat, because we started talking a bit about the research and the business case. So companies with more women in management reduce CO2 emissions faster. And there's really interesting research that has shown that a 1 percentage point increase in the share of women managers within the firm leads to a 0.5% decrease in carbon emissions. And they also remain competitive on returns. And so I think what I really want to emphasize that this isn't just about fairness, it's also about speed, because climate timelines are tight, capital efficiency really matters, and gender smart approaches help us move faster with the same or better returns.
How many stats do you need? Like the barriers remain, it's so, you're giving up, like, what are you seeing is it the communities of people to break through the barrier? Like, what's getting them through the barriers? Is it knowing that my competitor is doing this, or I don't know, what is breaking through?
So a few things. I think the communities of practice do help, because often what convinces decision makers is to see peers already doing it and having results. So even more than some of this more macro research and thought leadership, it's often a tangible case study like, oh, this peer organization, in this country did it, and these are the results that they are seeing. So this peer-to-peer is really powerful, and you can do it among bank CEOs or credit risk officers, right? Like you can think about those peer groups. You can do it among pension funds or family offices or foundations. Or we've also done it a lot with venture capital firms or private equity funds. And that is where you can, I think, most easily get momentum and see change. The other thing is also, if you think about the capital continuum, the asset owners, right? Because they are ultimately holding the capital, they have a lot of power, and they also often set the conditions based on which they allocate their capital to intermediaries like fund managers who then invest it into companies.
That makes sense. So this podcast is coming out still in the early days of 2026. And I hear you talking in kind of generalized terms, but I'd love to kind of talk a little bit concretely about what you're seeing in the field in early 2026. I know, at least from the US perspective, right, we just dealt with a really challenging external operating environment and an administration that unfortunately we're going to have for a couple more years. A lot of people taking out DE&I terminology. You yourself are based in Europe, but yeah, would just love to get some inputs on how you're seeing this work evolving kind of in this particular moment in the global business stage.
Yeah, so I think it hasn't become easier. I think with especially the situation in the US, there has been some real challenge to momentum. But at the same time, I think so many other regions and actors just kind of know that it is good business. So I would say the private sector really knows that it is good business. They're not yet doing everything right, but I think the urgency of climate action and the business case for climate finance is well established. And so I think now there is also growing momentum in recognizing that we have to make that capital more gender smart. I think if you look more at perhaps on the political side, right, around the world, I think there are also many countries that really feel the urgency because climate impacts are so visible every day around the world. And so I think while the current environment hasn't become easier, it is challenging. I think also if we take a more nuanced look at what's happening around the world, there's still strong momentum. And I'm optimistic that even as we navigate the current challenges and headwinds, that the bigger picture and the path we're on is a positive one.
Well, amen to that. I hope that is exactly what it's. I hope you've just laid out the weather report for us for,
I hope so too.
That, and it warms up in New York City. But are there any sort of like a case study, an example that you can point to where that this has moved from ideation into this is how we're looking at, this is how we're viewing our investments? Who's leading the way?
Let me perhaps share an example that's kind of a bit more from the ground, because I think there's so many interesting solutions that are already happening and that typically get overlooked and not funded. And so I think that's where we find the greatest inspiration and really those agents of change. So at 2X Global, we manage the Resilient Futures Fund that invests at this nexus of gender and climate. And an example that I really love from Francophone West Africa is Wake Capital. And so if we look at the local context, women-led small and growing businesses, they face a double barrier. They struggle to access growth finance, and they operate in climate markets that simply aren't designed with them in mind. So they're often invisible to traditional investors. And so through our Resilient Futures Fund, we support Wake Capital, a gender lens fund manager based in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire. And they invest relatively small tickets. It's around $100,000 to $500,000 into women-led businesses working in climate adaptation and clean energy value chains. And what's powerful here is that by backing a local intermediary who understands women's realities, capital reaches enterprises that mainstream climate finance would never even see, not because they're unviable, but because they don't fit the dominant investment model. And so it's not that the solutions don't exist, it's that the capital hasn't been looking in the right places. So I mentioned this example because I think it shows that there is so much happening. There's so many solutions that women advance at the front lines of climate action on the ground, and it's often invisible at the more global or policy stage. But we are starting to see things change. So we have allocated capital with our Resilient Futures Fund, and we now see that other investors are also backing those kind of solutions because we've kind of, made them visible. And there's now greater recognition that these kind of solutions really make sense, right? And that they don't fit the traditional mold, but that is where the opportunity is. And so we see kind of the ripple effects of one investor goes first and then others follow. And so I think that's just one example from one region of the world where change starts to happen. And those solutions that have been implemented for a while on the ground are now getting recognized.
That's so important. And I think especially when we think about this concept of first movers, right? Of just someone taking on the supposed risk of investing in these types of individuals and proving the ROI of these projects. So I'm really glad to hear what is happening in that region. And I think that leads us really nicely into some of our closing questions. And so hoping you can take out a little bit of your magic ball for predictions here to think about looking ahead to 2026 and beyond. What gives you the most hope about the convergence of gender and climate finance?
One thing that really gives me hope is gender is increasingly understood as infrastructure, not advocacy. And it's now embedded in global standards and disclosure frameworks and investor expectations. And also, younger capital allocators are far less tolerant of this myth of gender neutral. So that really gives me hope. I think also looking at the big untapped opportunities, the role of asset owners, for example, that I mentioned briefly. So that includes big institutional investors, development finance institutions, and multilateral development banks, but also, for example, women as wealth holders, and especially with the great wealth transfer in countries like the US and the UK. And they are the ones who can really ensure that this next leap isn't more pilot projects, but is really about changing the rules of how capital flows. And then the other thing that kind of is connected to that is this idea of rebalancing incentives. So rewarding adaptation, valuing resilience, and backing intermediaries who can aggregate women-led climate solutions. I mentioned this one example from West Africa, and that's just one of many. So we really now see many more women-led fund managers coming to market who are very often investing at this nexus of gender and climate in more innovative and effective ways. So I think seeing how asset owners are stepping into this role, using the power in a positive way to change how capital flows, and then rebalancing those incentives and backing those solutions, I think really gives me hope and a positive outlook for this year. And I think the next wave of climate finance won't just cut emissions, it will decide who gets to shape the future. And I think we're now finally seeing women at the table and having the opportunity to shape the future with their solutions.
Oh, I love that future. I'm all for it. Let's make that happen. And on that note, as we come to the end, so you have a lot on your plate. These are big issues. This is the entire finance and climate question you're trying to shape. So how are you taking care of yourself? What are you doing? Do you do anything for fun? We're always looking for suggestions here.
Yeah, I do things for fun. And I think it's such an important question, right? Because climate work is long-term. And so sustainability has to include the people who are doing it. And I think for many years, I didn't do anything. And now I'm really trying to focus more on the sustainability aspect at a personal level as well. So I spend time with my family, which is probably something that many people say, but I think it really makes a difference. I now have a little baby, so I really try to disconnect from time to time and just be in the present moment. Being out in nature, I also have a dog. I love being out in nature, and that really helps me to recharge. And then also meditating, which is something I don't have much time for, but I try to do it. I know they say ideally early in the morning. I usually do it before I fall asleep. And if I don't meditate, the last thing I do before I fall asleep is watch comedy, which also helps. And sometimes I look for comedy that, kind of.
Sometimes I can always find the time for comedy and not for meditating. So how do I do that?
No, I ask colleagues on my team to send me anything funny because I'm not very good at finding it myself either.
This is about women helping women here. So we're all for that.
Totally.
Oh,
Humor
yes.
has never been more important. And as someone who also tries to meditate regularly, I think anytime you can fit it in works.
Yeah.
So that's definitely, your brain will appreciate you. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us on Engaging ESG. I think all of our listeners will agree that your work really reminds us that fixing the funding gap isn't just about fairness, but it's really about building comprehensive climate solutions that actually work for everyone.
Thank you for joining us on Engaging ESG. Have a question for us to consider or a strategy you'd like us to cover? Email us today at engagingesg@gmail.com.
Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to Engaging ESG today. It helps us grow, and even better, be sure to share the podcast with your favorite sustainability, diversity, or social impact colleague. And until next time, keep engaging.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.